Hi guys, this week we're going to be talking about adjectives and adverbs. So adjectives and adverbs are similar to prepositions in that there are so many of them. Your book talks about several different types. And the other thing that's similar is that we don't go nearly as far in depth as your book does in teaching them in ESL. Something I was thinking about this week is that in teaching, my mentor at Harper told me less is more. And I totally agree with that. So when it comes to grammar, there's so much. You're never going to teach everything related to grammar to your students. Think about vocabulary. I learned that someone who was born in an English-speaking country and has at least a master's degree only knows 30% of all the words in the English language. Okay? So yeah, we're going to teach students more than 30% of the grammar of English, but there's no way you could teach them everything about prepositions and everything about adjectives and adverbs. So I know that our textbook is very, very in-depth, but think of it, so all teaching grammar textbooks are like that because you're the teacher. So you need to know all of those things. I'm not saying sit at home and memorize the textbook. No, think of it as it's your grammar dictionary. Okay, so when you have a question about teaching something, you can go back to it. Or if a student asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, okay, then you go back and look. And that's going to happen. You're going to be asked questions you don't know the answer to. And you just say, I have to think about that. And I'll get back to you tomorrow. There's nothing wrong with admitting you don't know. We're not walking encyclopedias. I was going to say thesauruses. Yeah. We're not walking encyclopedias. It's perfectly fine to say, I'm not sure. I'll look into it and tell you tomorrow, right? Because as teachers, we should be constantly learning, right? I take classes in linguistics every year. There's so much I don't know. So much. I'll never know enough about linguistics. So, and I constantly, I'm sure we all do, go to presentations on teaching methodology, and things constantly change, and they change their minds about what's a good thing to do. We're constantly learning, and that's what we should be doing as teachers. Okay, so my other dog is shaking. They like to make noise when I'm trying to do these videos. Back to adjectives and adverbs. So let's start with adjectives. So obviously, adjectives are pretty easy. They describe nouns, right? And what are nouns? So nouns, if we recall, and I'm going to post the phrase structure handout again for this week to go back to it. So remember our different phrases. So nouns can be the subjects or objects in sentences, direct objects, indirect objects, objects of the preposition. And nouns are people, places, things. They can also be more abstract feelings or ideas, right? Like education is a noun, government is a noun, happiness is a noun, sadness is a noun. So it's not just people, places, or things. Right? Animals are nouns. Okay? And so adjectives can describe all of those things. And in the sentence, an adjective either comes before the noun it describes, or it can come after a linking verb. Now, your book gave so many examples of different verbs adjectives can come after. In teaching, the only thing I've ever told students is adjectives come after linking verbs and describe that noun that came before the verb. Because again, you're not going to go so in depth. And a lot of things that students learn as they get into higher levels, a lot of things can be learned organically, right? Because we're talking about grammar, but they're also learning writing and reading. And so a lot of things come up about parts of speech in reading classes and writing classes, not just grammar, and in speaking. So a lot of that really in depth knowledge of forms comes kind of just organically. But yes, we would introduce what an adjective is, what it does, and where it comes in the sentence. Now, your book mentioned, and this is true, this is what I've seen in lower level grammar courses as well as writing courses, that adjectives are introduced, defined, talk about where they come in the sentence, and then they're taught in lower levels about the order adjectives come in sentences. Now, when I first started teaching, I was like, adjectives come in a certain order? Because, again, my 105 students, I get really excited about stuff like this. Things like the order adjectives are supposed to go in a sentence, that's subconscious knowledge, language knowledge for native speakers, right? We can read a sentence, and if the adjectives aren't in that preferred order, we'll be like, oh, that sounds funny. Okay, but it wasn't until I started teaching that I was like, oh, there actually is like a rule. I don't really think it's a rule. It's more like a preferred order, and that if you don't put adjectives into that order, native speakers are going to be like, huh? So your book has a table with that order, and that's what would be taught at lower levels. Okay, so here's the picture in your book. So it starts with article or number, opinion of the noun, size of the noun, shape, condition, age, color, origin. So that's what would be discussed at the lower levels in grammar. And then beyond that, this is brought up at the lower levels in writing class. So programs that teach the different skills, even if it's like at Harper, they're separate classes, reading, writing, listening, speaking, and grammar. But some places where they kind of teach all the skills together in one class, they'd still be reinforced across the different skills. So if this is introduced in grammar, it will also be taught in writing. And then at the lower levels, students write sentences or short paragraphs using these adjectives. And generally, we don't put, so you can list adjectives in a row, right? But generally, we don't list more than 3 in a row, or it starts to sound a little bit funny to a native speaker. So again, so once we get past the lowest levels of grammar, many grammar books don't really go too in depth or at all with adjectives, but you'll see them in writing because using adjectives for description is very important in writing. So here's a page from my high intermediate writing book where they talk about descriptive adjectives, define them, give them example really quick, and then talk about where they come in the sentence. And again, notice they just mentioned that it's before a noun or after a linking verb. They don't go more in depth than that. And then there's kind of an editing activity. And so generally we would take this further in writing. So for example, I teach the narrative, write about something that happened to you. And so we'd introduce adjectives, maybe something like this, and then talk about how important description is. So I give them examples of narratives with a lot of really good description, and we highlight the descriptive words, which can obviously be more than just adjectives, but we point to adjectives too and talk about how the writer is trying to paint a picture in the mind of the reader, and how much those descriptive words add to that story and the emotion and the feeling behind the story. Then I bring in pictures and have them talk about them and describe them. We also talk about how as you get more advanced, you should have variety in your description. Don't just use the same adjectives over and over again, okay? But try to use synonyms, and have more word variety. Just like in academic writing, you should have sentence variety, right? Don't write a whole essay with just simple sentences. You should have compound and complex sentences. Why? Just because it looks more academic. Your vocabulary should have more variety. So that's when adjectives come in more in teaching. Okay, so they would have pictures to describe with their classmates or write about with their classmates, and then I have them write their own narratives. Write about something, an event that happened in your life, and be sure to use a lot of description. Then when they come in and bring their papers in, have them highlight their descriptive words. Bring them up to the overhead, share with the class, and ask the class, is there enough description in this? Or can you find some words that we could actually add description to? And that's kind of teaching adjectives a little bit more organically and naturally, and what they would need to use them for. The other place you'll see adjectives and adverbs come up in ESL would be in both writing and reading classes, is when we're talking about word forms. So again, my 105 students, remember our morphology, prefixes and suffixes? It's coming back. No, just a little. So in writing, we would talk about, in editing, mistakes that students make. Often they choose the incorrect form of a word, right? If you have the noun success, you add FUL, successful, it becomes an adjective. If you add FULLY, successfully, it becomes an adverb. If you add ED, succeed, it becomes a verb. So often in writing, they choose the wrong word form. So we'll go over word forms and word families and work on editing word forms. So adjectives and adverbs come in there. In reading, as well as speaking classes. So in reading, whenever they read an article, they get a vocabulary list beforehand. And the vocabulary list will list the part of speech of each word. So there will be nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs in there. And then they're either defined, or the students have to find them in the reading and guess the meaning from context. And in that, it will reinforce where the different parts of speech come in the sentence. And I always try to point that out. When they have new word lists, I'll point out the new words in the reading and point out the definition and what it's doing. Okay, where does it come in the sentence? Is it a noun? Is it an adjective? Is it a verb? Is it an adverb? And that reinforces where those parts of speech come in the sentence. Generally in a reading book, if it's a good book, it will keep repeating those vocabulary words throughout the whole chapter. And then they'll have sentence fill in the blank, or write your own sentences, or ask each other questions using the vocabulary. So just like prepositions that can be taught like vocabulary, adjectives and adverbs can also be taught like vocabulary, or reinforced as vocabulary, because again, it's so big. You're not going to get it all done in just a grammar class. And in speaking class, before they listen to a listening, they'll get a vocabulary list, and it will mention the part of speech. And then they'll listen for those words, those new vocabulary words in the listening, and then talk about the listening using those vocabulary words, knowing if they're using a noun, verb, adjective, or adverb. So they'll be using it naturally. So those are all kinds of ways that we introduce and use adjectives and adverbs more naturally and organically. And again, the typical problems that students have with both adjectives and adverbs is often they mix up the two, especially using, and native speakers do this too, they use an adjective for an adverb because I think adverbs are difficult for everybody. She runs quick. She runs quickly. Add the ly. Also, as we talked about with prepositions, they have adjective plus preposition problems, choosing the correct preposition, and also positions in the sentence. Where do they go in the sentence? So, teaching them not just through grammar and fill in the blank activities, but having them use them in writing, write sentences, write paragraphs, and also, you may not teach a reading class, but you can always bring readings into a grammar class because reading is probably the best way for vocabulary development. So if you look at adjectives and adverbs as vocabulary, reading is the best way to develop vocabulary. So seeing them actually used within paragraphs, within articles, is very helpful for them to internalize where those forms go in the sentence. Now, another thing that students have trouble with, besides the typical errors that I just mentioned, are participial adjectives. These are kind of fun. This is another thing sorry, I'm such a grammar nerd. When things are difficult, I get excited about it, right? I don't know if you've ever heard a non-native speaker say, "I am boring," or "Are you boring?" Right? So what are participial adjectives? Participial adjectives are the present participle used as an adjective. That adjective has an active meaning. So I try to tell the students, you have to think about, you're not talking about a verb, but the noun that's describing is acting upon something else. And the past participle, that is being acted upon, right? So if class is boring, okay, that's not an action. That's an adjective. You're describing the class, but the class is what's being boring, right? The students are bored by the class. They're being acted upon by that boring class. So those are really difficult. And I took a picture of this page. This is from a high intermediate grammar book. Notice how they're just introduced in this little box real quickly. So that idea of less is more. So when I introduce something in grammar, I don't always say, "Oh, okay, open your books to page 236 and look at this chart." I generally do some sort of fun game in the beginning and then ask them for examples, or I put up my own examples. And then I usually save the charts for kind of review. We might look at that at the end of class to kind of review what we did. Okay, but I'm not just like a, open your book and look at the chart kind of teacher. But regardless, if I were introducing this by myself, I would still keep it that simple. So less is more. Your teaching grammar book is going really, really far in depth. You're never going to go that far in depth in teaching a class. You want to keep it simple for them to be able to understand it and internalize it. And I'm trying to make this bigger so you can see it more. And then again, these things can be reinforced. You're just introducing it in grammar, but then having them review it and use it in speaking and writing. And if they're moving up levels in a program, it will be reinforced in spoken class, writing class, reading class, and some things will just be learned organically as they're working on editing their own work and writing with more sentence variety. So when you first introduce something, you don't have to introduce everything all at once. Okay? Okay, adverbs. Adverbs are very difficult. They're difficult for native speakers too, because first of all, they can modify verbs. So I think that's what students learn first. They modify verbs and discuss how for the action, right? Like, she runs quickly. How does she run? Quickly. The boy talks loudly. How does he talk? Loudly. Okay, so that would be introduced in a low-level grammar class. And then you can divide. I like how your book divides them. So there's a chart or a table on page 252 that puts them in categories like manner, degree, duration, frequency, time, instrumental. So if you wanted students to practice them and you want to do it simply, you could choose one category at a time and have them practice speaking, writing sentences. You can do, especially if you're teaching children, do charades. So have them describe the action. Okay, in speaking, you could also have them write about it. They can look at pictures and describe the actions that are happening in the pictures, write about it, and talk about it. Okay, but where adjectives get difficult is they can also modify adjectives. They can also modify other adverbs. Okay, and your book talks about all the things that adverbs can mean, but usually when I want to teach them simply, I always say adverbs answer the question how. I know they don't always answer that question, but simply they answer the question how. So for example, she is very fond of chocolates. Okay, so where's the adverb in that sentence? Very. What is very modifying? It's modifying the adjective fond, but it's answering how fond of chocolates is she? She is really very fond of chocolates. So now really is modifying the other adverb, very. How very fond of chocolates is she? She's really very fond of chocolates. See how nerdy I am? I love this stuff. Okay. They can modify verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and whole clauses. So again, in grammar, you would introduce them at the lower levels as describing actions. And then as you get up higher levels, you can talk about how they can also modify adjectives and other adverbs. And again, this is going to really come out in a writing class and in that description that I talked about with adjectives. So when we're talking about adding more description in our writing, and it could also be in our speaking, previously I talked about adjectives, but description can use other parts of speech, and it can definitely use adverbs. So those adverbs are describing those actions. They're describing those adjectives. They're describing other adverbs. So in their writing and adding description, you can also have them practice those adverbs. Okay, and those adverbs will also come up in vocabulary lists, in writing with word forms, and also in vocabulary lists in reading, so they'll be able to see them. And it'll also come up in talks about suffixes with word forms, and luckily a huge percentage of adjectives end in ly, and pointing that out to students so they find those ly adverbs is really helpful for them. Okay, But in general, adverbs are difficult for students. They're difficult for native speakers. One thing that makes them difficult is what I just said. They can modify multiple other forms. The other thing is some adjectives and adverbs have the same form. Okay? The suffix doesn't change for the adverb. So those ones are confusing, where it's the same form for the adjective or adverb. So they're not sure what they're doing in the sentence. Is that an adjective or an adverb? One thing that helps is that so many of them do end in ly. Okay, so those are some difficulties. The other difficulty is the position in the sentence. So an adverb can come before the adjective or adverb that it modifies. So that's pretty simple. So if you see two adverbs together, you know that one adverb is modifying the second adverb. If you see a word before another adjective, well, it could be another adjective, but it could also be an adverb modifying that adjective. It can come first in a sentence. It can come before a main verb. It can come between a main verb and some other element, but it cannot come between a main verb and its object. It can also come sentence final. Okay, so I have never sat and gone through all of these different positions with students. Again, you're going to introduce them simply at a very low level and then kind of expand on it as their level gets higher through reading or writing and through description, and then as they're making mistakes, you can point it out. Okay, so, you put the adverb after the adjective, okay, and have them go through it more organically. I've never sat and just listed all of those different positions of the adverb. Or if I've mentioned them in writing class, like, yeah, you guys are having trouble with adverbs, and that's because it can move all over the sentence. But then just kind of keep it like that, let them write their descriptions, and then point out mistakes as they're making them. Your book mentions an activity where you put the adverbs in the wrong positions in sentences and then have the students try to find what is incorrect and to try to grasp the rule on their own. So that's another good one. So being sure that they get enough comprehensible input, so seeing it in reading and then having them practice it on their own and then having them edit their own work is a good way to work with adverbs more organically. I just wanted to point out a few more things. So mostly in grammar class, you're going to introduce adjectives and adverbs at a very low level, very simply. What do they mean? What do they do? What do they modify? Simply put, where do they come in sentences? But as I said, your book mentions those different categories or types of adverbs. Another thing we do talk about in grammar class at lower levels and then would be reviewed at more intermediate levels is the adverbs of frequency, right? Never, rarely, seldom, sometimes, often, usually, always, because that's going to come up when talking about tenses. So these would be introduced very early on with the present tense. And I believe your book mentioned an activity like this, having the students ask each other how often they do things. You know, how often do you eat dinner? How often do you eat dinner at 6 o'clock? How often do you watch TV? So they can walk around the classroom and talk to each other and ask each other those questions and write down the answers. So they're using those adverbs of frequency in sentences, talking about habits, and they can write it down while saying it So they're using those adverbs in speaking and writing. So those are very common adverbs. And not only are those important to talk about understanding this type of adverb, but any sort of time words are very important for the grammar of English because we have so many tenses, right? We talked about we have 12 verb tenses in English. And that's very hard for students to grasp, especially if those students don't have that many tenses in their native language. And I always tell them, what tells you what verb tense you need to use in English are those time words, right? When you see words like usually, often, sometimes, those are talking about habits, things you do all the time. That signals simple present because we're talking about habits, right? When you see words like since or for, you're talking about perfect tenses, something that began in the past and continues till now. When you see right now or now, that's talking about progressive tense. When you see last weekend, last year, yesterday, that's talking about simple past. Okay? So adverbs being one type of time word, adverbs of frequency, are very important in second language learning. So that is something else that's going to come up in grammar class. It will also come up in writing class, okay, to add those frequency adverbs in their writing. And they'll see it in everything. They'll see it in things that they read, they'll hear it, they need to use them in speaking. Okay, the last thing I'm going to mention are adverb clauses, and those are those dependent clauses that are attached in complex sentences. So I believe it was either the first or second week I put in a PowerPoint that talked about compound and complex sentences. I will put that in extra materials because that's another type of adverb, like because or time words, before, when, while, that begin independent clauses. And adverb clauses are usually introduced in more advanced grammar classes. They're mostly introduced in writing classes, starting at about the high intermediate level and going in advanced when we talk about sentence variety and using more compound and complex sentences in your writing. So I will repost that PowerPoint that goes over complex sentences and sentence structure.